CBS just hit the brakes on a political interview, not because of a breaking scandal, not because of a standards violation, but because of a federal broadcast rule most viewers have never had to think about. And if this is the new standard, it will not stay confined to late-night comedy. It could reshape how broadcast television handles candidates during an active election. This is the Grant Caldwell Report. Cut the noise. Here's what we know, what they're claiming, and the one thing nobody wants you to connect. Here is what is confirmed right now. Stephen Colbert says CBS lawyers would not allow his show to air a pre-recorded interview with Texas Democratic State Representative James Talarico, who is running for U.S. Senate. Colbert says the concern was the FCC's equal time obligations, the idea that if a broadcaster gives a platform to one legally qualified candidate, it can trigger equal opportunity requirements for opponents. The interview was released online instead of airing on the CBS broadcast. Now here is what is being claimed and where the fight starts. Colbert frames this as censorship and pressure tied to the current FCC posture under Chairman Brendan Carr. CBS disputes the idea that it blocked the interview outright, saying it provided legal guidance and compliance options, and that the show chose an online release path instead. And here is the detail most people are skipping. The equal time rule is not new, but recent FCC messaging has reportedly made broadcasters far more cautious about whether entertainment talk shows can rely on traditional exemptions the way they used to. Translation: what used to be treated like harmless late-night banter may now be treated like regulated candidate airtime. If you do not want to miss critical updates as this expands beyond one show, hit subscribe right now. Because the real question is not whether you like Colbert. The real question is who gets to define news, who gets to define candidate access, and whether corporate media will preemptively silence itself the moment regulators start hovering, especially when legal risk and business interest collide. Here is the verified timeline of what happened, based on reporting from multiple major outlets and what was said publicly on air. On Monday night, Stephen Colbert told viewers that his show had recorded an interview with Texas Democratic State Representative James Talarico, who is running in a U.S. Senate race in Texas. Colbert said the interview was scheduled for broadcast, but CBS lawyers did not allow it to air. Colbert said the legal concern was the FCC equal time rule. In basic terms, that federal rule can require a broadcast station that gives airtime to one legally qualified candidate to provide comparable opportunity to other candidates in the same race if they request it. The rule is tied to broadcast television and radio stations, not simply any online video. Keep this next detail in mind because it explains the network's decision-making. Colbert also told his audience that the interview was not aired on the CBS broadcast and that the show instead released the full conversation online, including on YouTube. Publishing it online was presented as a way to avoid triggering broadcast obligations tied to candidate airtime. Reporting also confirms the political timing in Texas. Early voting began in Texas primary elections on Tuesday, February 17, 2026, with a contested Senate race drawing active campaigning and heightened sensitivity around candidate exposure and access. Now watch the regulatory piece because it is central to why this story escalated. Coverage describes an FCC enforcement posture under Chairman Brendan Carr that has increased scrutiny of talk shows and entertainment programs discussing candidates. Multiple outlets report that the FCC has signaled a narrower view of which programs qualify for traditional exemptions that apply to bona fide news coverage. That matters because exemptions can determine whether equal time obligations are triggered by a candidate appearance. CBS responded publicly after Colbert's remarks. CBS disputed the idea that it blocked the interview as a political act and said it provided legal guidance and compliance options based on broadcast rules. CBS's position, as reported, is that the show made the choice to release the interview online instead of airing it on broadcast television. One more verified point before we move on. Colbert also raised on air the broader context that Paramount, CBS's parent company, has matters before the federal government that require regulatory review, including an FCC-reviewed merger process. That point is confirmed as something Colbert said. It is not confirmed as the reason CBS lawyers gave for their guidance. Now we separate what can be proven from what is being implied. The loudest claim is censorship. Colbert framed CBS's legal decision as the network effectively silencing political speech, and he pointed a finger at a tougher FCC posture in 2026. That is a claim about motive and pressure. It is not something we can independently verify from the outside. What we can verify is narrower and more important. CBS lawyers treated this as a legal risk problem, not a content standards problem. The concern centered on the FCC's equal time rule and whether a late-night entertainment show airing a candidate interview could trigger obligations to provide comparable access to opponents if they request it. Here is the reality check most viewers miss. The equal time rule is not new. What appears to be new is how aggressively broadcasters believe it could be applied to programs that used to be treated as safely entertainment or casually news-adjacent. And when lawyers get spooked, television does what television always does. It protects the license first, the segment second. Now CBS and Colbert tell different versions of the same moment. Colbert's version is direct. He says the interview could not air, and he says he was initially told not to discuss it on broadcast. CBS's version is more corporate. The network says it did not kill the interview as a political act, and that it offered compliance options, with the show ultimately releasing the interview online instead. So which is it? Blocked or guided? The verified reality is that the segment did not air on broadcast, and the full interview did go online. The internal legal conversation, and how hard the network pushed behind the scenes, is not fully visible to the public. Here's the one point that changes how you should view this. If broadcasters start treating candidate appearances on entertainment shows as a regulatory tripwire, then the practical result is the same no matter what label you use. You get less candidate access on broadcast TV, more corporate filtering, and more political content pushed into online platforms where broadcast rules do not apply. And that lands right in a lane Donald Trump would recognize instantly. Big media companies will talk about free expression, right up until their lawyers believe Washington can touch their bottom line. Then they fold quietly and call it compliance. One more fact to keep in mind before we move forward. Colbert also raised the broader corporate context, including CBS's parent company having major business interests that can require federal regulatory review. That context is real. The leap from context to that was the reason is not verified. Next, who actually benefits from this chilling effect, and who pays the price when broadcast networks decide it's safer to shut interviews down than to risk equal time demands? Now we get to the part that matters more than one late-night segment, who holds the power here, and how that power gets used without anyone ever having to issue a direct order. First, who actually made the call? Not Stephen Colbert, not the guest. This runs through corporate legal, broadcast standards, and executives whose job is to protect the license, protect the parent company, and prevent headaches that become headlines. If the lawyers say there is a risk, the default answer in legacy media is simple: do not air it. And here's the key accountability issue. If a rule can be enforced without being enforced, if the fear of equal time demands is enough to cancel interviews, then the regulator does not even have to act. The chilling effect becomes the tool. Keep that in mind, because it's the same dynamic you see across Washington. Pressure does not always arrive as a letter. Sometimes it arrives as a hint. Next, who benefits? Start with any rival candidate in that Texas race. If broadcast airtime becomes a trigger, opponents can seek equal opportunity. That can force the network into an impossible choice. Either open the door to multiple candidates or avoid all of them. And when a network chooses avoid all of them, the public loses access. That is the real result. Now zoom out. Who else benefits? Online platforms. If broadcast TV gets spooked, the conversation moves to the internet, where broadcast obligations do not apply the same way. That means less transparency and fewer consistent standards, and it pushes political speech into algorithm land. That is not a win for voters. Here is the part people argue about. Colbert implies political intimidation tied to the current FCC posture. CBS says it was legal guidance, not censorship. Both of those statements can exist at the same time, because the question is not what label you use. The question is whether large media companies are now making editorial decisions based on regulatory risk. And that is the Trump-aligned angle in plain English. Big corporate media talks brave until Washington clears its throat. Then it self-censors and calls it compliance. So here are the accountability questions that actually matter. Did CBS determine whether this interview qualified for a bona fide news exemption? Did anyone at the network seek clarity from regulators, or did they just default to silence? What was the internal threshold for risk, and who set it? And if the interview was safe enough to publish online, why was it too risky to air on broadcast? Because when the rules become blurry, power shifts to whoever controls the interpretation, and the public gets less information, not more. This isn't about liking Stephen Colbert. It's about how fast broadcast TV starts policing itself when election rules and regulators enter the room. Here's what's confirmed. Colbert said CBS lawyers would not let his recorded interview with Texas Democratic Senate candidate James Talarico air on the CBS broadcast because of equal time concerns. CBS disputes the framing that it was a political block, saying it provided legal guidance and options. The interview was released online instead of broadcast. Now the impact. If networks decide candidate interviews on entertainment shows are a legal tripwire, the safest move becomes book no candidates at all. That means less access for voters, more decisions made by corporate risk teams, and more political speech pushed into online platforms where the standards and accountability are different. What to watch next? Does the FCC clarify how these rules apply to talk shows, or does the gray zone get tighter? Do other networks quietly pull back from candidate bookings as the 2026 cycle heats up? Do campaigns start using equal opportunity demands as leverage, even if the goal is simply to scare stations off? We'll track the confirmed facts as they harden, and we'll separate them from the spin. Subscribe for updates. We follow the facts.